so this is the assignment. So last time in class we did an example of how gravity scaled. Okay, we showed a simple example of, like, if you come up with gravity is a simple example where we have a basic equation which describes the gravitational forces between two objects, and we figured out the scaling relations. We found that it scales as L to the fourth. Okay, this is one of the reasons why gravity is most significant at large length scales and it's not so significant at small length scales. We're going to be looking at many more examples of that today in various physical domains. And what I would like you to do, and this will be due next week, next Wednesday, is choose a physical phenomena or concept, preferably different than those above, and prove its scaling. Okay, so the first part is you're going to search out a phenomena in physics and look at the constitutive equations and describe how this phenomena will scale to the small length scale. Okay, it could be a certain area of physics that you're interested in. It could be something that you just want to explore. The second part of the assignment is to find a microscale device in the literature which exploits microscale physics, again preferably different than the ones that were presented during class, and derive the scaling relations which give the device a scaling benefit. So the first part of it you're looking at strictly at physical phenomena, and the second you're going to be actually looking up a biomems device or a MEMS device in the literature and showing why or how it exploits microscale physics. So does that seem like a reasonable assignment? And what we'll do is next week we will, on Wednesday, we will have, since there's only a handful of us in the class, only 8 folks, we can just have everyone go up 5 minutes each and just present your 2 ideas. Okay. If you need any help on this, obviously you can shoot me an email. If you need, if you have an idea and you want to get my feedback on it, I can help you with that. Yes.
So on Wednesday, do we have to just give you an idea of what we are thinking about the assignment, or do we have to be done with the assignment by Wednesday?
I think by Wednesday we can be done with it. Yeah. So work on it over this weekend, and you can do this assignment in terms of like a PowerPoint. Make a PowerPoint, make a few slides about a physical concept, and then a device which exploits microscale physics. The 2 could be related. Okay? All right, so we ended off with this example last time. So I'm not going to go over it again today. So let's go into a different example today. This is another physical phenomenon, diffusion. Molecules diffuse from low concentration, from high concentration to low concentration. And let me just go to this notebook here. Is anyone familiar with the concept of diffusion? What's the law that describes diffusion? Fick's law, right? Do you remember what Fick's law is off the top of your head? What's that? It's okay. It's okay. So the diffusive flux is equal to d times dc dx. So this describes one-dimensional diffusion. If this is x, if you have a concentration gradient, let's say you have a concentration gradient that looks like this. This is C of x, where C is a concentration. It could be the concentration of a molecule in solution. So molecules will diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So the molecules that are over on the left side here are going to diffuse this way. Okay. So there is there should be a negative sign here in this case. Right. So the concentration gradient, the slope of this curve, multiplied by the diffusion coefficient, is equal to this diffusive flux J. So if we look at the diffusion length, it's shown by this schematic here. Let's say we take two containers and we put them together. One has a high concentration and one has a low concentration. Over time, the molecules from the left side are going to diffuse over to the right side. The length, the amount of distance at which one of these molecules diffuses, this x that we're showing here, this x is given by this equation. X squared is equal to qid times t. Qi is a constant. It's either 2, 4, or 6, depending on whether you have one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional diffusion. T is the time, and then d is the diffusion coefficient. So the question is, how does diffusion time scale in a 3D volume? So why don't we, let's just do this as a warm-up real quick. What is the scaling relation here for three-dimensional diffusion? So let me rephrase by asking a more specific question. How long would it take for the molecules to diffuse from one side of the cube to the other? And how does that depend on the length of the cube? Let me repeat that. How long does it take for a molecule to diffuse from one side of the cube to the other? Since you have the equation here, that's figuring out the equation is the difficult part, right? From here, it's straightforward. Srikant, do you have?
X squared by qi.
Yes. So how does that scale then?
L squared.
Just scales as L squared. That's right. So we have this relation x squared over 6d is equal to t. All right, and this is describing the process by which, let's suppose you have a high concentration of molecules on one side of the cube. How long will it take for these molecules to get to the other side of the cube? Okay, so we're talking about three-dimensional diffusion here. How long will it take for these molecules to get over here? In other words, how long will it take for the entire cube to, for the concentrations to equalize? So the time here is equal to x squared divided by 6d, and the distance it has to travel is the length of the cube. So this part of the equation here scales as L squared. The bottom half of the equation is constant. So the diffusion time T is proportional to length squared. So at the microscale, diffusion, it takes, concentration gradients equalize out very quickly. What does this mean? Well, if we were to take, if we want to mix up a solution, a lot of times with biological tests, we have to mix up the reagents together. The smaller we make our container, the faster mixing by diffusion happens. Right? We may not even have to actively mix. If we can, if the size scale is very small, the mixing can happen just by diffusion. So this has some important implications. If we were to take a, let's see. So if we're looking here, if we were to take a volume, a cube, and shrink it down to smaller length scales. All right, so let's say starting off with the size of the cube, that's 1 millimeters. If the cube is 1 millimeters, it holds 1 microliter of sample. The typical diffusion time across this cube is 500 seconds. Well, that's a pretty long time, right? So when you're working at length scales of around a millimeter, you can't rely on instantaneous mixing by diffusion. You may actually have to wait for a while. Okay, so as we go down to 1 nanoliter, we're scaling down the length by a factor of what? If we go down to microliters to nanoliters, oh, it says right here, the size of the length of the cube, we're scaling down from 1 millimeter to 100 microns. So we're scaling down L by a factor of 10. So if we scale down L by a factor of 10, how much does the diffusion time scale?
100.
By 100. It scales as L squared, right? So this is a nice example of that. We're scaling down the length by a factor of 10, but the diffusion time is actually scaling down by a factor of L squared, which is 100. So you can see the effects of that here. The typical diffusion time across a 1 millimeter cube is 500 seconds. We go down by a factor of 10, it shrinks down to 5 seconds. We go down by another factor of 10, it goes down to 0.05 seconds, so 50 milliseconds is the diffusion time. And then if you go down to even like 1 micron size cubes, which gives you femtoliter volumes, this gives you diffusion times of a half a millisecond. Okay, so quite small. So this is one of the reasons why folks are very interested in miniaturizing chemical reactions. The first day in class I talked a lot about the economics of it. We're saving a lot of reagents because reagents are very expensive. But there's another benefit of it too, that when you do reactions at the smaller scale, mixing happens much more rapidly. Reactions can happen faster if the reactions are diffusion limited. All right, so between the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, you can see in this little chart that we're going from 96 well plates to 300 well plates and so on. We're going to larger and larger plate formats, and the corresponding volumes are shrinking as well. Any questions about diffusion? Okay. Another example, which is kind of fun, is looking at the scaling in biology. Have any of you seen this thing before, Kleber's law? So this was an interesting study that was done back in the 1930s. And they were looking at organisms of various sizes. Nature is a very good example of the benefits of scaling. Okay, if you look at nature, you'll see that organisms at the microscale behave differently than organisms at the macroscale. Okay, one example is, this is not quite on the topic of this slide, but if you imagine that if you have, how does a dolphin propel itself? How does a whale propel itself in water? How would a whale or dolphin propel itself in water? I mean, what's the body part that it has to do that? Yeah, it's just a fin, right? Because that fin goes back and forth, it displaces water, that propels the whale or the dolphin forward. But if we're looking at propulsion at the microscale, like for example a sperm, how does a sperm propel itself? It turns out that it has something called a flagella. It has sort of like a corkscrew type motion. Okay, as that corkscrew turns, that's what propels the sperm forward. There's no flapping motion. Flapping motions wouldn't work that well, or they would not be very efficient at the microscale. All right, so you can see a lot of very beautiful examples of things like this in nature, because nature self-adapts. Right? So this particular study was showing that the metabolic rate for all organisms scales with the organism's mass. And if you think about this in terms of a thermal model, this sort of makes sense. Okay, if you think that an organism needs to maintain temperature, you can make an argument for this. But let's look at this plot first. Okay, so over here on the right side we have the large organisms. You know, this mass is shown in the x-axis on a log scale. On the y-axis we have the metabolic rate. So the mass is in terms of grams or kilograms. The metabolic rate is kcals per hour. So what is metabolic rate, by the way? Let's all make sure we're on the same page. What is metabolic rate? Yes, exactly. The rate at which your body burns energy. So as the organism gets larger, its metabolic rate increases. All right, and this is the metabolic rate per capita, per ounce of body weight. All right, so the metabolic rate increases on a log scale, the mass increases on a log scale. Why does this metabolic rate increase? Why does it need to consume more calories per hour? Well, one explanation, which was given in the late 1800s, is that the heat flux away from an organism is proportional to its surface area. Okay, you make this argument. We're going to talk about thermal microsystems a little bit later in this lecture. But if we recall from last time's lecture, heat flux. Heat flux is heat flowing out of a surface. If we back up here into with this slide here, heat flux was one of those surface fluxes. It scales as length squared. All right. So the heat flux away from an organism is proportional to the surface area. Q out is proportional to L squared. The organism's metabolic rate, R, has to be equal to its heat loss. Okay, if an organism, let's say a warm-blooded organism, it needs to maintain its body temperature, right? So it's losing all its heat to its external surroundings, and it needs to generate the heat internally in order to maintain its body temperature. All right, so this was the key observation here. Now, an organism's mass is proportional to L cubed. Right, and if we just solve for L, we find that the L is proportional to mass to the power of 1/3. So if we assume that this Q out is proportional to length squared, as we said earlier, and if we plug in this relationship between length and mass, then we come up with this relationship that the metabolic rate scales as m to the power of 2/3. The actual scaling rate relationship is m to the power of 3/4, and that's explained sort of on the next slide. So what is this basically saying? As you increase the mass of an organism, it has more mass, but its mass is going up at a slower rate than its surface area. Okay. If we put this, let's put this in terms of surface area to volume ratio, because that's what we talked about last class. An elephant, how does the surface area to volume ratio of an elephant compare to the surface area to volume ratio of a mouse? Which one has a larger surface area to volume ratio? Yes. The mouse is whatever is at the smaller length scale has a higher surface area to volume ratio. All right. Now, if you have a larger surface area, and surface area to volume ratio, then you're going to be losing more heat. Remember, we talked about this example last time in class that thermal objects tend to heat up and cool down rapidly at the microscale, right? So a small object is going to tend to lose heat more rapidly than a larger object. So actually the mouse has to work harder. The mouse has to consume more calories per gram of body weight than the elephant does. Interesting, right? What does that mean in terms of nature? The mouse needs to eat more often. The mouse needs to eat more frequently. At some point, this becomes not so efficient because if you're losing body heat at such a rapid rate, this means you have to be eating constantly. You have to be consuming a lot of calories. So this is one of the reasons why if you look at this graph here, the warm-blooded organisms are only appear on the far right-hand side of the diagram. You won't find a warm-blooded organism that's smaller than a mouse or smaller than a hummingbird. I think that's one of the smallest warm-blooded organisms. Because at that scale, once you go smaller than that, there's just the surface area to volume ratio is too high. You're losing a lot of heat rapidly. It's very hard to maintain your body temperature. So at this end of the scale, you notice that in nature, these are all cold-blooded organisms. They're not maintaining their body heat. They're just adopting the temperature of their surroundings. All right. This famous study just basically showed that the metabolic rate, they tracked the metabolic rate by measuring how many calories these animals were consuming per hour, right? And they made this chart that way, and they found that this nice scaling relationship exists throughout the spectrum. Pretty interesting. So this scaling relationship was this basic analysis of heat loss from a body explained that the metabolic rate should scale as m to the power of 2/3. But in reality, if you look at this chart, they found that the biologists found that the metabolic rate scales as m to the power of 3/4. Why the difference in the exponent? Well, there's another phenomenon that occurs in biological systems as well. And that's the fact that you have to deliver nutrients. You have to deliver nutrients to all the cells in the body. We just looked at diffusion. All right, suppose we have we were talking about tumors last time. Suppose we have an organism that's composed of a bunch of cells like this. Okay, I'm not going to draw all of them, right? So we have a cell in the middle here, right? And this is the environment. Multicellular organism. So just tumors look kind of like this. Now, the environment has nutrients. Nutrients from the environment go into here, and then waste products are excreted out. We just looked at this argument about diffusion time. Okay, what's going to happen to the diffusion time as this multicellular organism gets larger and larger? The diffusion time is going to go up as a function of L squared. Not just L squared. So if you were to double the size of the organism, how would the diffusion time change? If I were to double the size of this organism, how would the diffusion time change? Diffusion time is proportional to length squared. So if you double the length, The diffusion times goes up by a factor of 2 squared. So it goes up by a factor of 4. At some point, it takes too long for nutrients to diffuse in and waste products to diffuse out. Like for someone at our length scale, if we were just composed of a blob of cells, the cells in the middle would get starved. So what's the solution that our body has? What does your body use to distribute nutrients? Sorry?
Circulatory system?
Yeah, exactly. Your blood vessels. So only small organisms can do this kind of thing, where they only rely on diffusion for nutrient distribution. If you have much larger organisms will have a capillary network that branches out like this into increasingly smaller segments. Each one of these will branch out, okay, like the pattern that you see here. All right, when you have these, when you have the capillary beds like this, then these capillary beds can deliver nutrients to cells in the body. Okay, this is why larger organisms have to have some type of capillary network for distributing nutrients faster. Okay, this is where your blood is actually being pumped through the vessels. The nutrients are being delivered by advection, not just diffusion. Advection means like it's in the fluid and the fluid is being pumped through near those cells. And then diffusion happens from the wall of the capillary into the cell. So the diffusion times are still relatively small. Okay, so using fractal theory, you'll see that plants have these types of networks within their tree trunks. Our circulatory system has that. If you look inside our lungs, there's a branching network inside the lungs where you're going to smaller and smaller sections of the air pipe, and only in those really tiny sections is where the actual exchange between the air and the blood vessels happens. So based on this concepts of fractal theory basically means like self-similar structures. It's possible to actually derive that instead of this the physiological variable scaling as a multiple of 1/3, instead it scales as a multiple of 1/4. So y being the physiological variable, m is the mass of the organism, and b is the scaling exponent. All right, so you notice in this chart here, this was showing that the metabolic rate scales as mass to the power of 2/3. It's a multiple of 1/3. The fractal law is a basis for describing why a lot of things in nature actually scale as a multiple of 1/4. All right, and it has to do with the analysis of these capillary networks, the branching networks that deliver nutrients to the cells. Okay, so it's not just an issue of heat loss from the organism, and it's actually being delivered. Nutrients being delivered to the cells is another requirement for the organism to survive. So if you look through nature, there are physiological variables. This is kind of interesting. Think about this, like the rate of heartbeat. It scales as y is the variable. It's proportional to mass to the power of b, and this is the scaling exponent. So the heartbeat rate scales with the exponent negative 1/4. All right, the period scales opposite. The lifespan scales as m to the 1/4. Larger organisms tend to live longer, right? The elephant lives longer than the mouse. The diameter of tree trunks scales as m to the 3/4. The diameter of aortas, your main blood vessel, scales as m to the 3/4. The mass of the brains scales as m to the 3/4. Metabolic rate we saw earlier. some of the latest observations in metabolic rate that it shows that it's scaling as m to the power of 1. Okay, but we're not going to get into all the details of that. All right, so there's scaling in biology as well, and scaling of organisms. So let's talk about the scaling of physics in various domains. A few examples are here. And your examples that you do in your projects may be inspired by some of these things as well. But I suggest that you find an example of something that we don't cover in these lectures. Electricity. The energy contained in an electric field is proportional to the electric field squared. All right, I apologize for this this confusion here. E is equal to epsilon E squared, so the E is the energy, and the E on the right-hand side of the equation is the electric field. So the energy contained in an electric field is proportional to length to the negative 2. The resistance of a material, the resistance is rho times L divided by A. L has, the length on the top of the numerator. The length in the numerator has units length. Area in the denominator has units L squared. So this scales as L to the negative 1. The resistive power loss, V squared over R, that scales as L to the negative 1. All right, because the voltage is also, the resistance scales as L to the negative 1, but the voltage also scales appropriately. So each one of these things assumes a certain set of, assumes that certain things scale, certain dimensional variables scale according to the assumptions. Okay, so the assumptions that were used in these analyses, they're not all here, but I'm just trying to give you some examples here. Some of the well-known examples. So in mechanics, the spring constant of a cantilever beam, Srikanth, we were talking about that the other day. The spring constant is how rigid a cantilever beam is. The higher the spring constant, the more rigid the beam is. The harder it is to bend the beam. So the spring constant is Wt cubed times the Young's modulus divided by 4L cubed. All right, so if you do the scaling analysis on that, then the spring constant scales as length. Right. So as we scale down to microscale, let's say you're balancing something. Let's say you're balancing an object at the tip of a beam, something like this. Do you have a diving board? And you have an object here. Another example of scaling. If you were to scale down the dimensions of this object, if we think about this problem, there's a gravitational force that's pushing down on the beam that causes it to deflect downwards like this. And the spring constant of the beam is how rigid the beam is. That's what prevents the deflection from happening. So what do you think will happen as we get down to the microscale? What will happen to the deflection of the beam? Let me write this down. At microscale, or let's say as we shrink the system, how will the deflection change? So let me give you one equation to help you out in this. The deflection, well, there's Hooke's law. Force is equal to K times X. X is the deflection. This is the force. And then this is the spring constant. Let's do a quick analysis of this. What will you find with the deflection? How does the deflection scale? You can go ahead and try this if you want to take a second. So right now we're looking at mechanical deflection. And this is Hooke's law. This is a cantilever beam with spring constant X, or K. And let me just put FG over here. The deflection is delta X. This is a delta X here. All right, so how does the delta X scale?
It reduces.
It reduces. Right, right. So let's, if we could go through that, delta X is equal to F,
Like
yep, F divided by K, force of gravity divided by the spring constant. So this is proportional to, so how does the gravitational force scale? Yes? I heard it. L cubed.
L cube.
That's correct. Gravitational force scales as L cubed, and the spring constant scales as L. So then this is proportional to L squared. Right. So what does that mean then? How do we physically interpret that? L squared is a higher order function, right? That means at the large scale, the deflection is going to grow very, very quickly. Once you get to the small scale, it's going to do exactly the opposite. You'll get very, very minute deflections. So if an ant is standing on an ant-sized diving board, the deflection on that diving board is going to be very tiny, relatively speaking, compared to the relative amount of deflection that I would get in the same system if I was standing on a human-sized diving board. All right, so this is the kind of thing I want you to think about. I want you to think about the physics of things, how physics changes at the microscale. We're going to give you, I'm giving you a lot of examples here, and a lot of the things that we're going to focus on this class have to do with the scaling of fluids, right? Things like laminar flows and so on. But as graduate students, what I want you to come out with in this class is the ability to analyze a new physical phenomena. It might be something that you explore in your research or in your in industry projects and whatnot. I want you to be able to derive things from first principles. So we're just giving a few examples of how to do that right now. In microfluidics, yes?
So we did that example before me at L to the fourth, but it scales to L to the third here. Why was it L to the fourth in that previous example, the first example you did?
The gravity?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
is that the same thing? Or I know how we got it, but I just wondering.
Okay, so let's just go back up. I think I still have that example here. Maybe not.
I'm just wondering why those are different scales. Like in this example, and then in that example.
Yeah, so this is this example we found that it's scaled as L to the fourth, right? This was a gravitational force between two bodies, separated by a distance. So it's a different problem than something sitting on the end of a diving board. Right? So this is what I'm saying, like, even though we're dealing with gravity here, how something scales depends a lot about the actual physical system that we're working with. So the thing that you brought up is actually a very good point. You should be very careful about just saying, like, making generalizations that this scales, gravity scales as length cubed, so this is a length cubed phenomena. No, you should actually go into the specific system, show the equations for that specific system, and then derive the scaling relations from that point. Okay, too often folks end up making just hand-wavy type of arguments like that, where it's just, oh yeah, it's a length cubed phenomena. If you look into it, you'll see that it may be or may not be. Okay, so going into some standard type things that in fluidics and heat transfer. Reynolds number. The Reynolds number is the ratio of inertial forces divided by viscous forces on a packet of fluid. All right, what happens if you have a lot of viscous force and no inertial force? Then the flow is laminar. Predictable flow patterns, no turbulence. Turbulence is where you have unsteady flow patterns, things that change with time. Turbulence in a plane you've experienced. Right? Diffusion time of a chemical species dissolved in fluid. The diffusion time scales as length squared. We did that example. In heat transfer, the conduction between two connected bodies, that changes as a function of L squared. All right. Just keep in mind again that we have to state the assumptions that we're the assumptions that we're making in deriving some of these scaling arguments. In this power loss equation that we talked earlier, we're assuming that the voltage stays fixed while we scale down the length. So this numerator is not a function of length, is what they're saying here. Okay, but that could change. You may as you change the length scale of a device, you might want to change the voltage also. With transistors, for example, when we scale transistors to smaller sizes, we often make the voltages smaller as well. Yes.
So if the numerator is not a function of the length, why is it L is a -1 as opposed to L?
It should be L. I'm sorry. This is a typo here. Okay, I'm sorry about that. If you assume a fixed voltage, then this should scale as L. Thanks for pointing that out. In fact, let me just make that fix here. All right. Now, I just said that you should always understand the scaling relations from first principles, right? Don't just make assumptions about things. Okay. That being said, sometimes it's useful. Okay, I'm going to present the other side of the coin right now. Sometimes it's useful to have some just rule of thumb kind of ideas on how things scale, right? So this is giving a few examples of that. Okay, this is from Ellis Meng's textbook, Scaling of Forces and Phenomena, or textbook Biomedical Microsystems. They're talking about forces in nature and how they scale. Intermolecular van der Waals forces scales as L to the -7. The density of van der Waals forces between interfaces scales as length to the -3. Electric field scales as length to the -1 under certain assumptions. All right. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that the forces and phenomena that have a negative exponent, large negative exponents, those are the ones that become very significant at small length scales. The phenomena that have large exponents, positive exponents, those are the ones that become more significant at the macro length scales. All right, so things like gravitational force. All right, notice that this chart here is saying that gravitational force scales as length cubed. All right, in our previous analysis, we saw that the gravitational force between two bodies actually scales as L to the 4th. So you do have to state your assumptions here. But the point that we're trying to make in this slide is that gravitational force has a large exponent, so that becomes more significant at the macro scale. And things like van der Waals forces on this side of the table become more significant at lower length scales. So, in the first part of your assignment, when you're asked to look at physical phenomena, you could take some of the physical phenomena from this chart if you'd like, and find, actually derive what this scaling law should be based on the equations that you may look up in online. See if it matches up with the scaling laws that are listed in this chart. If not, then maybe you can figure out where the discrepancy is and what were the assumptions that were used in this chart. The references, you can actually look up Ellis Meng's Biomedical Microsystems. Some of the book is available online, and you can look up references 14 and 15. Okay, I can also post that online if anyone's interested. All right, so things like capillary force scale is length to the 1, so that becomes more significant at the small length scales. Area, electrostatic force, volume mass, these scales is larger exponents. All right, so if I were to be a little bit more specific about what I said earlier, these types of things are important at the atomic scale, subatomic scale. These types of things get to be important in the nano to micro length scales, and then these start to become important at the macro length scales. This is another chart from another textbook by Drexler. It's an online textbook called Nanosystems. This also talks about the scaling of forces and phenomena. Now this particular chart has just a scaling exponent. Instead of saying L squared, it just says 2 here. And it talks about typical magnitudes of that force. Now what you're going to notice is there are some discrepancies between this chart and this chart. And again, that has to do with the assumptions under which these scaling relations were derived. Okay, but this gives you some idea of a few things, that are not in the previous chart. For example, this talks about capacitance. It talks about wear life, frictional force, oscillatory frequencies, and so on. Okay, you can look at this chart too and see where some of these scaling relations come from. You can try to derive some of those. Any questions? Any questions so far on scaling relations? Yes.
I still have a question on the example you gave us on the spring content, the Hooke's law. Do you think that K has a direct proportion to L? Why?
Okay, just a sec. The K, that's coming from this portion of the example here. In mechanics, the spring constant of a cantilever beam, K, scales as a length. So, if we look at where that comes from, width. So these portions of what the spring constant is. W is the width of the beam. T is the thickness of the beam. E is Young's modulus, which is a constant. And then on the denominator, you have 4, and then you have L cubed. So in the numerator, it's L to the 4th, right? Because width is length, and then L cubed is also length. L to the 4th, and denominator, you have L cubed. L 4th divided by L cubed, so it scales as L.
I just confused with the equation that F equals to Kx. Because K has a unit of N per M, right?
Newtons per meter.
Yeah, per meter.
Right.
So why is not 1 over L, but L?
Force equals Kx, so K is newtons per meter.
Yeah.
Right? So newtons per meter multiplied by meters will give you newtons. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. All right. Let's. I think this is a good stopping point. Let's take a short break. Take a few minutes break, and then we'll talk about these different flow analogies between the different domains. So the next thing we're going to go into is understanding the electrical domain, understanding the fluid domain, understanding the thermal domain, and actually what the similarities between them are. Okay. So we'll take. Let's just take a 3 or 4 minute break. Okay, so the next part of this this module is going to be getting into analysis in different energy domains. All right, so the title of this module is Scaling Laws and Analysis in Various Domains of Engineered Systems. Okay, so how many of us in the room are electrical engineers by training? Okay, how about mechanical engineers? 1, 2, 3. Okay, chemical engineers, fluids engineers, environmental engineers. Okay. So this is pretty typical of folks who do research in MEMS actually come from all different backgrounds. One of the challenges that we often face is that we have to learn different domains than what we traditionally studied in undergrad. Especially nowadays, fields are, engineering schools are focused on one type of engineering. You go and become an electrical engineer, you'll know circuits really well, but you won't know fluids at all. Okay. So in the MEMS field, we often have to be interdisciplinary. We have to understand different energy domains. And from my perspective, the best way for you to know that, and Pong, you're nodding because you're working on a microphone, right? You're working on a microphone at one point. And now you're working on more like electronic sensors, right? So you've had to learn the different energy domains too, so you probably struggled with that at one point. In my opinion, the best way for an engineer to learn a different energy domain is to understand the similarities between the domain that they originally studied and other domains. Okay, it turns out there are a lot of analogies like that. So I want to explain these 3 domains to you in that context, on those terms. Because I think that this is something that really helped me. I think it will really help you as well. So what I'm going to show you right now is the similarities, or what are called flow analogies, of in the electrical domain, the fluid mechanics domain, and the heat transfer domain. Okay, for some of you this might be familiar, but for others of you it may not. So let's take a closer look at this. In a lot of domains of engineering, a lot of domains of physics, things are moving from one place to another. So that's the concept of flow. Okay, in the electrical domain, it's charge moving. Moving charge is electricity. That charge can be positive or negative. In fluid mechanics, you imagine a packet of fluid, a small volume of fluid moving from one place to another. In the case of heat transfer, it's heat energy. So the units for heat energy is joules. By the way, the units for a packet of fluid would be meters cubed. It's a unit of volume. And for charge, it's coulombs. Coulombs is a unit of charge. Okay, so in each one of these energy domains, you can imagine that things move from one place to another. All right, so over on the left, I think I'll just have to point because this thing doesn't, I don't want this to crash again like it did last time. So in the electrical domain, since most of us are from the electrical domain, let's start off with that. In the electrical domain, charge flows from high voltage to low voltage. Right? So if you have a positive charge Q, that charge will flow from high voltage to low voltage. And you've all seen the example of an electrical circuit that looks like this. A voltage source, which could be a battery. And then you have a load. We often represent a resistance as a load. This could be a light bulb. Right, when we put a voltage across here, in two terminals of our load, electric current forms, flows as I. We define electrical current as a movement of positive charge. So you can imagine that there are a whole bunch of charges moving from the positive voltage terminal to the negative voltage terminal, the high voltage to low voltage. So that idea, that concept extends to fluid flow and heat transfer as well. So if we look at fluid flows from high pressure to low pressure. Right? So just like we have Ohm's law, V equals IR, there's a corresponding law in fluid mechanics that the delta P, the pressure difference between two ends of a pipe, is equal to Q, which is the flow rate, times the hydraulic resistance. The same idea, same form of the equation. In electronics, we imagine a charge moving from high to low voltage, and this is not a pipe, this is a wire. And in the case of fluid flow, packets of fluid flowing from high pressure to low pressure. Relations are really the same. In electronics, we talk about the resistance of a wire. What does that resistance depend on? Those of us who are electrical engineers.
For example, the surface area of the
Yeah.
of wires and
The surface area of the wire. Right, the cross-sectional area. The wider a wire is, the more cross-sectional area it has, the less resistance it has, right?
the length of the wires, because we have the more length.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, we actually had the formula for resistance is actually right here. The resistance is length. The length of the wire, the longer the wire is, the more resistance you have, divided by the cross-sectional area. That's A. So the wider the wire is, the lower the resistance. And then on the denominator, you also have the conductivity. That's a material property, right? You could have a very high conductive metal, like gold, or you could have a very poorly conductive metal, like platinum. Okay? So the electrical resistance represents how easily charges move through the material. So similarly, there's a concept of hydraulic resistance. How easily fluids move through a pipe. As you can imagine, it also depends on the diameter of the pipe, just like electrical resistance depends on the diameter of the wire. But in fluids, one of the differences is that it turns out that the denominator is r to the power of 4, radius to the 4th, whereas here is just radius. A is radius squared. This has a length squared dependence in electronics, but in fluid flow, it actually has an L to the 4th dependence. But the intuition is still there. The smaller you make the pipe, the harder it is to push fluid through there, right? So there's your concept of hydraulic resistance. So let's look at the formula for hydraulic resistance. It's 8 times mu times L divided by pi r to the 4th. Mu is the viscosity of the liquid. So if you're trying to push honey through a pipe, it's going to be much more difficult to do that than it is to push water through a pipe, right? So there's a viscosity element that's a material property. It depends on what you're trying to flow through the pipe. In the case of the electrical domain, the material property is the conductivity of the wire, the conductivity of the material. So there's also something called the thing called the potential variable, and there's something called the flow variable. The potential variable is also called the forcing variable, the forcing term. Okay. This is intuitive with fluids. If we're putting pressure on one side of the pipe, we can imagine that we're putting a force there, right? That pressure is pushing fluid through the pipe. That's a force. So that force, that pressure is referred to as the potential variable. It's also called the force variable. In electronics, or in the electrical domain, the forcing variable is a voltage. Because the voltage is creating an electric field, and that electric field is what pushes, it causes the charge to move from one side to the other. So the potential variable here is V. And the formula, as I mentioned earlier, V is equal to IR in the electrical domain. The potential variable in fluid flow is P, and P is equal to Q times the hydraulic resistance. Now the flow variable represents what is moving. In the electrical domain, that's the current. What's the units for current?
Amperes.
Amperes, and what is 1 ampere?
9640.
Oh, you're thinking about the constant. What's the definition of 1 amp?
How many charges passing in the surface area, especially surface area in the medium, for example, wire or something like that.
Right.
Yes.
It's a number of charges passing by per second. So for those of you who aren't electrical folks, let's talk about flow variables. So in the electrical domain, imagine that we have a cross-section of a wire, and within this cross-section, let's take a cross-section in the middle here like this. Okay. If we were to look at this point in the wire and we imagine how many, there are a bunch of charges here, and these charges are all racing through the wire. If we were to count how many charges pass this area, per second. So we're looking at this cross-sectional area in the middle here, and we're just counting the number of charges the number of individual charges that are flying by that cross-sectional area. So this is the current, I, and this is given in coulombs per second. Number of charges per second. So you rewrite this I, and the units for I is amps, and 1 amp is 1 coulomb per second. All right, going to the fluid mechanics domain, same thing. Imagine we have a pipe here. Again, we have a cross section in the middle of the pipe. And in this case, what we imagine little packets of fluid. This packet of fluid moves through this cross-sectional area. This little packet of fluid moves through this cross-sectional area. How much, here we're asking how much volume of fluid passes the cross-sectional area. Per second. So the units for this would be, we call this Q, the volumetric flow rate, and it's given in terms of meters cubed per second. It's a volume of fluid per second. This is charges per second, this is volume of fluid per second. So this is the electrical domain. And then this is the fluid domain. So you're starting to see these analogies, right? So the flow variable is I. The way that we define I, we call it I is equal to the current density times the cross-sectional area. Going back to this graph, so I is given in terms of amps per second. This concept of current density, J, is equal to I divided by the cross-sectional area. So this would be amps per meter squared. Right. So it's the total current divided by the cross-sectional area of this region here. So let's define this. Let me write this down. So this is current, I, and then this is current density. All right, on this side we have, this is called the volumetric flow rate, or we'll just call it flow rate for short. Now if we look at the analogy for this, Q, the flow rate, is equal to the velocity times the cross-sectional area. So in this case, it's just Q is equal to the velocity times the cross-sectional area. And this is average velocity. Sometimes there can be a velocity profile where the fluid in the middle of the pipe is moving faster than the fluid on the edge of the pipe. Okay, if I was going to state this just in the same terms as the other equation, we can say the velocity is equal to the volumetric flow rate divided by the cross-sectional area. And this is the average velocity. All right, the units on top here is meters cubed, and the units on the bottom is meters squared. All right, so if you're forcing a certain amount of flow rate through a pipe, okay, and then you shrink down the size of that pipe, but you're still flowing, you're still jamming the same amount of flow through there. The velocity of the flow is going to be higher, right? You guys have all seen this when you squeeze a pipe. The velocity increases in the region where you make the pipe smaller. Similarly, if you were to take a wire and you make that, let's say you have two very wide pieces of wire, okay, and somewhere that wire gets damaged, and for some reason that the wire diameter there is much smaller, what's going to happen there? The current density there is going to be much larger. So what I'm drawing here is, like, let's suppose we had current running through a pipe, and there's two very wide sections of pipe, and then in the middle you just have this narrow section here. And you have current going through here. So the current density in this region, in the middle region, is going to be much larger than the outside, right? So one of the things that current density does, it actually causes heating. Right, so those small regions can actually heat up, and that leads to failures in electrical circuits. All right, so we've covered the potential variable, we've covered the flow variable. Now we'll come back to capacitance in just a second, but let's move on to the thermal domain. All right, so just like charge travels from high voltage to low voltage, fluid flows from high pressure to low pressure, heat travels from hot to cold. So heat energy, the units for this is joules, travels from hot regions to cold regions. So imagine that we have two areas which are at different temperatures. The difference in temperature is delta T. And they're connected by something that allows heat flow. So let's say a metal wire. Okay, a metal wire conducts heat relatively well. We have this relation that looks very much like Ohm's law, or very much like the fluid flow equation. Delta T is equal to QH times RTH. All right, QH in this case is given in watts, joules per second. Okay, so that's the flow variable here, and then this is the potential variable. So how do we come up with those things? Well, the flow variable in the case of electrical currents. If you imagine a whole bunch of charges flying by through the wire, so coulombs per second is the flow variable. Coulombs divided by the unit time. Now, if we do the same thing to the thermal domain, what's a joule per second? What's 1 joule per second?
Is Q the thermal coefficient?
Q in this case is the power,
I mean
the heat flux.
Thermal.
I'm sorry?
I'm talking about the thermal domain.
Mm-hmm.
So Q is the thermal coefficient, or
Q is the heat, the heat flux. Yeah. So Q would be, the units for Q would be watts, joules per second. Just like in the electrical domain, it's coulombs per second. Here you have joules per second. 1 joule per second is a watt. Right, so this is your flow variable. Notice the similarities between the electrical and thermal domain. I is equal to J times A. QH is equal to JH times A. So JH is actually the heat flux, watts per meter squared. And QH is given in terms of watts. And then area is given in terms of meters squared. Just like you have the resistance of a wire, the hydraulic resistance of a pipe, you have the thermal resistance of whatever is connecting the two temperature bodies. And the thermal resistance is, the equation for that is very similar to electrical resistance. Thermal resistance is equal to the length of the whatever is connecting it. So let's say you have a metal wire between a hot and a cold region. The length of that wire divided by the cross-sectional area divided by the thermal conductivity. All right, notice that these equations are essentially identical. This is the sigma is, in this case, is the electrical conductivity. And in the case of the thermal domain, it's the thermal conductivity. All right, but the geometric parameters are pretty much the same. So if you were to shrink the diameter of the wire that's connecting the hot body to the cold body, well, you'll decrease the amount of conduction, the heat conduction between the two. So something that complicates the thermal domain is that you can also have heat conduction through air. In the electrical domain, you connect two things together. The current only travels through the wire because air has no conductivity. But in the thermal domain, if you connect two bodies together and you connect like a metal, like a wire between them, a lot of the heat will go through the metal wire, but some of the heat will actually go through the air as well. So we can actually model the transmission through the air as another resistor, or as another path. Okay, so we're going to get into the modeling. Each one of these domains, just like we can model electrical circuits with voltages and currents and resistors and so on, we can model the other domains as well using circuits, circuit diagrams. Any questions so far? Okay. So we had talked about the concept of resistance. We can also talk about the concept of capacitance. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. You have to think about these ones. So capacitance in an electrical circuit is a form of energy storage. And so let me draw this out here. Capacitance. So in the electrical domain, we put a voltage here. If we put this across a capacitor, we get this relation Q is equal to CV. You end up building, if you put a voltage across the two plates of a capacitor, you get positive charge buildup on one plate, negative charge buildup on the other plate, and the amount of charge you have, so this is in coulombs, this is given in terms of capacitance, which is in farads, and this is given in volts. This is the relationship for capacitor. Now, what does that mean? Let's think about this in terms of what the unit quantity is. In electronics, we're dealing with charge. Okay, the capacitor stores charge. It's a form of energy storage. All right. One of the reasons the voltage across a capacitor can't change instantaneously is because the voltage has a certain amount of charge across it. It's going to take some time for these charges. If you try to, if you remove a voltage source here, and you connect a resistor here instead, it's going to take some time to drain away all that charge. So that's one of the reasons the voltage across a capacitor can't change instantaneously. Let's see. In the fluid domain, again, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. There's a hydraulic capacitance. Oh, let me do the capacitance for an electrical system. The capacitance for an electrical system is C is equal to epsilon A over D. Is the area of the capacitor divided by the thickness between the two plates. And in the fluid flow domain, the idea behind a fluidic capacitor is the concept that a fluid can, if a container could expand or contract to hold fluid. All right, I'll try to explain this. So imagine an electrical circuit with a resistance here. We put a voltage here across that resistor. Okay, current flows through here. So this is a circuit that doesn't have any capacitors in it. It doesn't store any charge. The charges are just flowing through the resistor. The analogy in the fluidic domain is if we were to have a pressure source and we were to have a pipe like this. So we'll call this a pressure source. And so we have just flow through a pipe, just like we have the flow of current through the resistor. This can be modeled by the same circuit, by the way, this fluidic element. Now, the capacitance portion of it, is there some way to store charge in a fluidic system? The answer is yes. If we had, for example, a container, a bladder, that is that may be a portion of this system here. Okay, so we have fluid flow going through here. So the fluid can go through this way, or it can also go down this way. And as you put, as a fluid goes in there, this thing can expand and hold a certain amount of fluid. It's storing fluid just as the capacitor is storing charge. Okay, so in fluids, you have some type of fluid storage element. In electrical systems, you have a capacitance where the capacitance stores charge. In the electrical domain, you have this relation I is equal to C dV dt. If you connect a charged capacitor to a circuit, the current that pulls charge away from that capacitor will ultimately change the voltage of the capacitor. In the fluidic domain, the flow rate that drains that balloon. Okay, imagine the balloon that's full of water, right? And then you let that balloon go. It's going to drain that water away, right? So as it drains that water away, the balloon is losing its stored volume of water. Just like if you connect a capacitor to a circuit, the capacitor loses its charge into the system. Okay, or if you touch a charged capacitor, that capacitor loses its charge through you, and you get a shock. Okay, so I hope you can start to see some of the analogies between these different domains. We can actually spend hours and hours talking about these, but we can come back to these. For those of you who are interested in this more, we can come back to this later. So CH in the fluidic domain has to do with the ability of a container to expand to hold fluid. K is the compressibility of the fluid or the container, just like the capacitance is the ability of a capacitor to hold charge. The V is the volume of the container. Just like the voltage across a capacitor can't change instantaneously, for those of you who are coming from the electrical domain, in the case of a fluidic capacitor, the pressure across an elastic container can't change instantaneously. Now moving on to the thermal domain. The thermal capacitance has to do with the ability of an object to retain heat, just like capacitor is the ability of the system to retain charge. The unit quantity here is heat. So all objects actually have a thermal capacitance, right? Because it takes time to heat an object and to cool it down. The larger an object is, the more time it takes for you to heat it up and cool it down, right? Same idea. So you can think about in the thermal domain, a larger mass results in a larger heat capacity. That is what increases the thermal capacitance. If you heat up a gigantic pitcher of water, or if you heat up an entire pool of water, there's a lot of energy stored in that system, right? It takes a long time to heat up an entire pool. Just like if you had a huge capacitor, it takes a lot of current to charge up that capacitor. If you were to heat up a pool, you have to put a lot of thermal energy in there. You have to heat it for a long time. All right. So this system can also be modeled. All three of these systems can be modeled by electrical circuits. We'll talk about examples there. In the case of the thermal system, you have QH is equal to the thermal capacitance times the change in temperature divided by time. And the thermal capacitance is equal to the specific heat multiplied by the density multiplied by the volume of the body. Okay, so there's actually there's a material property here, the specific heat of the material, Cp. In electrical domain, there's a dielectric constant which talks about the ability of a material to retain charge. Any questions about this stuff? All right. We can come back to these later. I mentioned that, so we can actually use circuit elements like resistors and capacitors and voltage sources and so on to actually model things in different energy domains. Okay, the use of circuit diagrams is not just limited to electrical circuits. We can use them in other domains as well. And I gave the examples of the electronics, the fluid flow, and thermal domain because those are the most intuitive ones. But this also extends to species transport, meaning diffusion. You know how things, how a chemical species will move from high concentration to low concentration? Same idea as what we've just been talking about. It's a physical it's something that moves from one place to another due to some type of gradient. Okay, so in the case of species transport, the potential variable is concentration, the flow variable is mass flow, the unit quantity is a packet. It's actually just a molecule, so it has some mass associated with it. The resistive element is a diffusive resistance. The capacitor is when you absorb species somewhere, so there's a storage element there. And even in the mechanics domain, you can use these analogies as well. The potential variable can be velocity, the flow variable can be force, the resistive element is lubricity, capacitor element is mass, inductive element is compliance. We haven't talked much about the inductive portions here. We didn't talk about that on the last slide. It's a little less intuitive, so we're not getting into the details of that now. But I want you to know that they do exist. All these different energy domains can actually are modeled by a set of differential equations. They're modeled by a certain set of physical laws. And those physical laws are actually quite similar from one domain to the other. That's the point we're trying to make here. So we can start with the electrical domain. We have about 10 minutes left, so we can get started on this one. We'll have to continue next time. A few things that I'd like to show. In each one of the domains, what we're going to do is just cover some of the very essential and basic concepts in a single slide. Imagine covering an entire semester's worth of undergraduate concepts in a single slide. You can't do it. Okay, so, but I want to just remind you of some of the important concepts and some of the more important equations involved in each one of these energy domains. In the electrical domain, since many of us are from there, the variables of interest are voltage, current, electric field, current density, charge density, things like that. Electrical domain is mainly concerned with the movement of charges from one place to another. Electrical currents. We're often calculating electrical currents in various types of devices. In the electromagnetics portion of this, we're interested in how electromagnetic waves propagate. So it's not charges moving through a material. We're more interested in how waves propagate through space and air. So wireless communications is based on electromagnetics. The relevant material properties that we're often concerned with. If we're dealing with the movement of charge through a material, we're interested in how conductive that material is, the electrical conductivity. If we're interested in seeing how much charge something can store, we look at the electrical permittivity. This determines capacitance. The magnetic permeability determines the inductance of a material, and it also has to do with how electromagnetic waves propagate through a medium. We often do circuit analyses with Kirchhoff's laws, KCL and KVL. And a lot of the analytical equations are here on the right side. From a very fundamental standpoint, the conservation of charge, current, the resistance, capacitance, inductance, electromagnetic forces, Lorentz force and Coulomb's law, and then Maxwell's equations down here. This is what governs these four equations. Pretty much describes the whole electrical domain. These four differential equations describe everything in the electrical domain can be derived from these set of Maxwell's equations. I think I would like to touch on this a little bit so you know what the fundamental forces are. One is a Lorentz force and one is the Coulomb's law, which just describes the electrostatic force. Back to this drawing again. I always like to come back to this. If we put a positive voltage here, we get positive charges, negative charges, and we get an electric field. This electric field, if we were to put a charge Q in that electric field, the force is equal to the electric field times Q. This is the electrostatic force. There's also an electromagnetic force called the Lorentz force. If a force is traveling, if a charged particle is traveling in the presence of a magnetic field. V cross B. This one is less important, but just so you know that if a particle is moving in the presence of a magnetic field, that magnetic field will cause this charge to deflect its trajectory. There's a force that the magnetic field acts on only if the charged particle is moving. You may or may not remember this from electromagnetics, but that's what the Lorentz force is. Those are some of the fundamental forces in the electrical domain. This is a really great resource that I recommend. I look at it myself a lot. It's called Hyperphysics. Have any of you seen this before? As I said before, a lot of times us as engineers, we're trying to understand different energy domains, especially in the field of MEMS, right? This Hyperphysics website is really nice. It's been around for more than 5 years at least. It talks about all the different energy domains, the different areas of physics, and you can just, if you need to understand a physics concept, this website seems to just describe it really nicely. So, for example, if we go into electricity and magnetism. Everything is here. So under electricity and magnetism, we talk about electrical circuits. We talk about different circuit elements. We talk about, electric charge, Coulomb's law, Gauss's law, electric field, voltage, electrical currents. And then on this side, we talk about magnetic field, Ampere's law, the Biot-Savart law. And we have the Lorentz force here. Even if you did an entire undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, you may have forgotten about some of these concepts. So it's really nice to be able to go to one of these things and just look up Coulomb's law like this. And you can see how the different concepts are actually related to one another. Right? He has these cards which describes a lot of these fundamental concepts. And they're relatively short descriptions. They're not pages and pages. So in your projects, if you happen to be doing a project that's outside your main area of expertise, which I'm sure you will be doing at some point, use this website. Because the nice thing about it is that it is not just limited to one energy domain. It treats all the energy domains equally well. So if we go to, let's see, we go to mechanics. So there's a whole bunch of different things within the mechanics domain, Newton's laws, velocity, acceleration, angular momentum, all that stuff. And if you click on here, fluids, you can see a lot of there's a whole bunch of concepts related to fluids here. Right. Some of them might be familiar to you, some of them might not be, but really great way to learn about these things. This way that no energy domain that you go into it's never intimidating to you. Okay, you should at some point you'll feel confident in, even if you don't know a certain area of engineering, you can teach yourself it. And that's what I want you to be able to do. So this covers the electrical domain. We're out of time today, so we'll start with next time the scaling advantages within the electrical domain. So we're going to talk about the electrical, thermal, fluid domain, and we'll talk about some of the scaling advantages in each one of these domains. We'll talk about how to do modeling in each one of these domains. This modeling and scaling and this kind of thing, all of them will be a part of your class project. All right, so we'll end there. So for those of you who you've downloaded the notes, if you have not, please do so. And the assignment is on the second to last slide in the notes. Okay? And plan on doing that, to work on it this weekend. Next Wednesday, and we'll try to, I would like you to turn in your concept, or turn in this assignment written out or typed out, whatever you'd like, but also prepare just like 2 slides, 2 PowerPoint slides. The first one is on a physical phenomena or concept. The second one is on a device. And just present those 2 slides to the class, and it'll be fun. We can learn a little bit about different devices and how they scale. Okay? All right, so we'll end there.